Mr. Speaker, is Donald Trump running a cabinet or a country club? Because every day it's getting harder to tell. Not only is the president spending vast sums to ferry himself and his entourage to and from his various golf courses, but now it turns out that top leaders in his administration have developed a special fondness for traveling by private jet. The Treasury Secretary used a taxpayer-funded plane to hop down to Fort Knox to see the eclipse, for example, and he has also asked us to use one for his honeymoon in Europe. Trump's EPA Administrator, Scott Pruitt, spent another $58,000 on private jets. But the worst offender is HH Secretary Price, who, in his brief time in office, has already chalked up an astonishing $400,000 in flights on private aircraft. He flew down to Tennessee for all of 6 hours, much of which was spent having lunch with his son. That's nice. He also jetted off to an island off the coast of Georgia for a trip that apparently featured far more recreation than government business. Clearly, when it comes to travel on taxpayers' dime, the price does not matter to Tom Price. Ethics and personal responsibility doesn't matter to Tom Price. Doing what's right doesn't matter to Tom Price, and that's why he needs to resign immediately. Now, don't take my word for it. Here's what President George W. Bush's top ethics official, Richard Painter, said about Price's travel habit. I quote, "To use a charter flight on something that combines personal and government business, I think is highly unprofessional and really inappropriate." Those are strong words. But Mr. Speaker, you know who summed up best how terrible it is for someone to use private jets? Tom Price himself. Let's see what Tom Price said. In 2009, he described government officials taking private planes as just another example of fiscal irresponsibility run amok. I couldn't agree more, Mr. Speaker. Price spent nearly $25,000 to fly from D.C. to Philadelphia and back for one single day. He could have spent, at last minute, $725 to get there on United Airlines, or $133 to get there on Amtrak. Mr. Speaker, I just checked on my phone that an Uber to Philly right now, back and forth, would have cost Mr. Price about $450 round trip. That means that for the price of his private jet, he could have ordered individual cars for himself and his 54 staff members. Every American who works and pays taxes should find this totally appalling. Amtrak was good enough for the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden. But somehow it is beneath the Treasury Secretary and HH Secretary to ride the train. Riding the train is apparently even beneath the EPA Administrator. Here's a good rule of thumb. Mr. Speaker, if you're spending more on private jets than most American families make in 1 year, you're spending too much on private jets. Tom Price has plenty of time to go jetting around the country, but not enough time, for example, for the millions of kids who won't lose their coverage when the chip expires soon. There's apparently plenty of money at HHS for private jets, but very little to help people sign up for health insurance. That's completely unacceptable. Secretary Price says he needs to fly around on his jet to connect with ordinary citizens. I'm not kidding. His press secretary told reporters that these outrageous junkets were about getting outside of D.C., making sure he is connected with the real American people. Mr. Speaker, here's how you really connect with your fellow Americans. Don't take a private plane, fly a middle seat in coach. Of course, we should have seen this coming. News reports earlier this year revealed that when he was a member of Congress, Price was guilty of introducing legislation to benefit his own personal investments. Even more egregious, he traded more than $300,000 in healthcare industry stocks based on insider information. There's no question Secretary Price needs to resign right now. And if he doesn't, President Trump needs to fire him. Donald Trump claims that he loves firing people. He once said, "I love doing it if someone really, really, really deserves it." Mr. Speaker, Secretary Price really, really, really deserves it. Then again, we all know Trump won't actually do anything. We're all familiar with the Trump way of doing business with its bad deals and bankruptcies. Here's the Trump way of doing government. Number one, hire people proven to be corrupt. Number two, create an environment which corruption and bad behavior are encouraged. Number three, do absolutely nothing when the corruption and bad behavior is exposed. This administration talks about putting America first. This administration talks about draining the swamp. but its cabinet officials are more interested in traveling first class. This administration talks about making America great again, but they're really only concerned about never ever having to wait at another airport gate again. This administration talks about fighting for working families, but its top leaders are only concerned about lining their own pockets and taxpayers' hard-earned money. I am fed up, and so are the American people. Let's bring back government to the people, for the people, instead of government for the powerful friends of Donald Trump. Thank you. I now yield back my time to my friend from California, Mr. Lieu.
Thank you. I'm Congressman Ted Lieu from Southern California. I want to thank Congressmember Gallego for that terrific presentation. We're also joined today by Congressmember Raskin, who will be part of our dialogue as well. And today is Thursday. That means we all need to ask, why does Jared Kushner still have a security clearance? He already submitted 2 false ones, but I digress. We're actually going to talk about 3 other problems in the White House, one of which is Secretary Price. To my left is a picture of the private jet that Secretary Price flew on at taxpayers' expense. But in addition to Secretary Price, we also have Secretary Mnuchin, who flew on a government jet with his wife to Kentucky in order to watch the eclipse. Now, I get that was a pretty cool thing to do, but you shouldn't be using taxpayer funds to do that. And then we've got EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, which, according to media reports, spent $58,000 on non-commercial flights to go to different places. With $58,000, you can do a lot with that. Vote Vets put out a release today saying that with $58,000, you could hire a VA spinal cord specialist at the Syracuse VA nurse for 1 year. And then Secretary Price spent over $400,000 of your money. And that is a lot of spinal cord specialists. So we're talking about raiding the public funds and raiding the public trust. That's why I have introduced the Swamp Flyer Act. And what this act will do is stop this from happening in the future. It will prohibit senior cabinet officials from using non-commercial flights unless they certify under penalty of perjury that no commercial flights were available. So in this case, you had Secretary Price, for example, flying from here to Nashville. I guarantee you there were lots of commercial flights. There's no reason he had to take a non-commercial flight. And in addition to what we're seeing with these 3 cabinet officials, we do have sort of this culture of corruption that really needs to stop, because this flows from the top. And with the president, what we have now is the president staying at all these properties, private properties, that are his or owned by his family. And then he comes with this massive entourage of Secret Service and other folks, and they are paying money to these properties to stay there, to eat there, and all of that money flows back to the Trump organization. So the president is enriching himself and his family at taxpayers' expense. It is no wonder that we've got these 3 cabinet officials doing these insane things with taxpayers' funds. And now we've got a Republican Congress unwilling to do oversight on this. You've got Speaker Ryan recently going on TV saying that he thinks the president's administration is doing great. Well, you can't have this kind of taxpayer waste when you've got the public trust at issue. We also have responses from these departments that are deeply troubling. So this Treasury Department, in response to what Secretary Mnuchin was doing, in addition to his non-commercial travel to Kentucky to watch the eclipse, he also asked if the Air Force could fly him and his wife on their honeymoon. The answer is no, you can't do that. Now, the response from the department was, well, he needed to have secure communications. Well, that was the wrong response. I can guarantee you there are other ways of getting secure communications other than have the Air Force fly you around on your honeymoon. With Secretary Price, again, the department gave the wrong response. They said, well, Secretary Price needs to go around meeting Americans and he shouldn't be waiting 4 hours at the airport. Wrong response. Yes, he should be waiting 4 hours at the airport because that's what other Americans do. And I can guarantee you no American flies $25,000 to a place to meet other Americans. Again, the wrong response from that department. What we need is to have these 3 cabinet officials apologize. I joined with Ruben Gallego as well as Jamie Raskin and other members yesterday in a letter to asked for Price to resign, and all of us are also co-authors of the Swamp Flyer Act. What we need now is really for the public to get engaged, because what we're seeing is fraud, waste, and abuse with multiple members of the Trump cabinet. And with that, I yield back to Congressmember Gallego, who will mention Jamie Raskin.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield as much time as possible to the good gentleman from Maryland, Representative Raskin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gallego, and thank you for your leadership on this essential question of public integrity. I also want to salute my colleague from California, Mr. Lieu, who has been a leading voice in demanding real financial accountability in administration. I want to underscore some of the things that my colleagues have said, Mr. Speaker. If there are any Americans out there who love to fly wherever they want, whenever they want, at taxpayer expense, then we've got the perfect job for you in President Trump's cabinet. Now, of course, only billionaires and millionaires need apply for these jobs, but if you have a taste for fancy chartered air travel paid for by hardworking Americans across the country, this is undoubtedly the job for you. My friends, while millions of desperate Americans are suffering in the sweltering post-hurricane conditions of Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Florida, Texas, and Louisiana, we've got cabinet secretaries who should be doing everything in their power to save our people, but are instead looking out for something far more important, apparently, than other Americans' mere survival. They are focused on their own first-class private charter airplane flights to cushy destinations paid for by hundreds of thousands of dollars of taxpayer money. We kid you not. This comes out this week. It comes out that Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price is less interested in health and human services than he is in wealth and valet services, despite the fact that he blasted the use of government-paid jet travel on CNBC just a few short years ago. He seems to have come down with a severe and chronic case of swamp fever, billing you and me and millions of other Americans for 26 customized, deluxe, premier, first-class private charter plane flights at taxpayer expense at an extraordinary estimated cost of more than $400,000. That's just one cabinet secretary. Now, I can't blame him for one of the trips that he took in August to the beautiful and secluded St. Simon's Island in southern Georgia, and another trip that enabled him to get to his condo in Nashville and to have lunch with his son. You can hardly blame him for wanting to get out of town and to see the family. After all, it was hot here in Washington, D.C., as climate change sets in across America and the world. But as we say on Capitol Hill, it's not the heat, it's the stupidity. And look at what our Secretary of Health and Human Services did. And here I'll read from Politico, September 26th, an article entitled, "Price's Private Jet Travels Included Visits with Colleagues, Lunch with Son." The HHS Secretary combined official travel and meetings with friends and family. Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price took a government-funded private jet in August to get to St. Simon's Island, an exclusive Georgia resort where he and his wife own land, a day and a half before he addressed a group of local doctors at a medical conference that he and his wife have long attended. The St. Simon's Island trip was one of two taxpayer-funded flights on private jets in which Price traveled to places where he owns property and paired official visits with meetings with longtime colleagues and family members. On June 6th, HHS chartered a jet to fly Price to Nashville, Tennessee, where he owns a condominium and where his son resides. Price toured a medicine dispensary and spoke to a local health summit organized by a longtime friend. He also had lunch with his son. An HHS official said both of the Georgia and Tennessee trips were for official government business and were paid for by the department. It's no problem getting out of town and going to see your family, but really, do the taxpayers have to pay for it? If the taxpayers have to pay for trips like this, couldn't Secretary Price at least fly on first-class commercial airplanes rather than jacking up the taxpayers for tens of thousands of dollars to book a private airplane to do it? Politico asked the same question. Here they said, like some of the other 26 flights that Price took on corporate jets since May, identified by a Politico review, The trip to Tennessee appears to have occurred despite the existence of multiple commercial flight options. The trip to Georgia, while less direct, could have been accomplished with a routine connecting flight through Atlanta's busy international airport. On August 4th, Price flew a Dassault Falcon 2000 twin jet from Raleigh, North Carolina, where he'd given a speech to a flu vaccine manufacturer, to Brunswick Golden Isles Airport, which is about a half-hour drive away from St. Simon's Island. It was the same plane that had shuttled him between 5 states in 4 days, one that HHS had chartered through Classic Air Charter for more than $86,000, according to federal contracts. The plane arrived in Brunswick at 4:02 the afternoon before the start of the 2-day Medical Association of Georgia retreat, and roughly 40 hours before Price addressed the group, according to airport records. At about the same time, there were connecting commercial flights from Raleigh to Brunswick via Atlanta that would have gotten Price to St. Simon's Island that evening. My friends, you can go back and you can look at all of these cases. For example, Secretary Price chartered a plane for $25,000 of government money from Dulles Airport to Philadelphia, a distance of a mere 135 miles, when a charter flight, that charter flight left 5 minutes after a regular flight flew, commercial flight flew from Dulles for a few $100s. So he paid $25,000 and left several minutes later than he would have left had he just taken the commercial flight. He also could have taken, of course, the Amtrak, which is what most people do when they're going to Philadelphia from the Washington area, for a mere $72. Even the first class Acela would have been around $200. He could have taken British Airways. They go there, whose slogan is to fly, to serve. I guess that's not quite right. Or he could have taken Southwest Air. Their slogan is low fares, nothing to hide. I see that wouldn't have fit. Maybe JetBlue, you above all. That could have worked. But no, instead he had to book the private jet and fly for $25,000 from here to Philadelphia. Mr. Speaker, this is an old Washington story. The people who say they're coming to drain the swamp have become the swamp. And this is not something that affects just one cabinet secretary. Several cabinet secretaries are doing this, as my colleagues have pointed out, with Secretary Price, who seems to be the captain of the swamp flyers, and Secretary Pruitt, who's a frequent swamp flyer himself, and Secretary Mnuchin, another swamp flyer. We have a serious staph infection spreading throughout the Trump administration. And why not? The president seems to have evolved a whole new model of government in the 21st century. Government as a money-making operation for specific families and specific tiny groups in the society. And that's the message that pervades the Trump administration today. Mr. Speaker, we need to pass the Swamp Flyers Act, which is very simple. It says that those of us who have the honor and the privilege of coming to serve the American people here in Washington, D.C., should use regular commercial air flights unless it's a matter of national security or unless there's not a commercial flight that will get them to where they need to go. But the idea that you have cabinet secretaries who have already taken dozens of flights paid for with hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars of taxpayer money when a commercial flight would have done is an absolute scandal. Now, it hasn't gotten much attention yet, because on the scale of the scandals we've seen in this administration, I agree it's a relatively small one, but it is a dramatic and vivid illustration of what is going on here. The people who said they were going to drain the swamp became the swamp. And now the swamp pervades everything. Every cabinet, all of the secretaries, the entire government is engulfed in this kind of corruption, and it begins right at the top, where President Trump has continued to collect hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in foreign payments at the Trump Hotel, at the Trump office tower, at Trump golf courses around the world from foreign governments, and has not once come to the U.S. Congress to ask for our permission and consent, as is required by Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8 of the Constitution, which forbids the collection of presents, emoluments, offices, and titles from foreign governments by anybody who serves under the United States. who holds an office under the United States. And this president is not only collecting rampant, extreme amounts of money through his businesses from foreign governments, he's not even asking us for our permission or our consent. We have got to pass the Swamp Flyers Act. I commend Mr. Lieu for writing this immediately when the news broke about this rampant abuse of current regulations. We need to take a stand as a Congress on a bipartisan level. Unanimously, we can pass this to say that government officials should not be flying at taxpayer expense for dubious reasons. We should be using coach like everybody else, flying commercial like everybody else. You got to fly first class, fine, fly first class, but fly commercial unless it's a matter of national security or unless there's not a commercial flight that will get you there. Is that something that we can agree on a bipartisan basis? I just want to say earlier today we saw a magnificent example of real public service and public dedication by our distinguished colleague, Mr. Scalise, who has returned, thankfully, to this body, and he demonstrates and embodies what's best in terms of public service. Unfortunately, we've also seen in Washington this week the personification of what's worst in public service. We've got to stop taking the American taxpayers for a ride. Let's pass the Swamp Flyers Act immediately. And with that, yield back to Mr. Gallego.
Mr. Speaker, can I request a time check?
32 minutes remaining.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Lieu, how often do you fly back, and where do you fly back to?
I fly about 3 times a month, and I generally fly from Dulles back to LAX in my district, and I fly commercial.
How long is your flight?
It's about 5 to 5.5 hours, depending on the wind.
Representative, you and I have been members of Congress together since 2015. At any point in any of your flights to and from your work, from here to your home, have you ever used a chartered plane?
No.
Would you even be able to, by law, use a chartered plane according to the funds we are allowed to expense?
No, if I did that, I would be the subject of an immediate congressional ethics investigation.
So what makes Mr. Price think that he is somehow above the law, that he is allowed to do this, considering that he knew, as a member of Congress, that that was not allowed, and that somehow that he can just take advantage of the situation now that he has suddenly moved up after only just a few months of being in Congress to be the Secretary of HHS?
That's a great point, because what Secretary Price and Mnuchin and EPA Administrator Pruitt did was not only disrespectful to the taxpayers, they were violations of the federal regulations. So I'm just going to read to you what the federal regulation says. It says, your agency must select the method most advantageous to the government when considering travel. Advantageous to the government, not to Secretary Price or Mnuchin or EPA Administrator Pruitt. They violated that federal regulation straight up. That's why Tom Price is under federal investigation. It's why the IG is investigating Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, and now we call on an investigation of EPA Administrator Pruitt as well for violating the federal regulations.
And while you were talking about that actual regulation, and to see how well and easy it is to not violate the regulation, I literally just typed into Google flights to Philadelphia. And there's a flight leaving in 46 minutes. And the cheapest I found right now, I found one for $441. I found another for $447. If you want to connect to Philadelphia, which I don't know why you would, but if you want to do that, JetBlue will take you to air for $264. So in Secretary Price's effort to live an extravagant lifestyle and basically void himself of all common sense, he also violated ethics violations. And this is something that we consistently see within this Trump administration. And on the other flip of that, we consistently see a Republican-led Congress that is not doing their duty by the Constitution of oversight on the executive. Not one movement has been done by any Republican, especially Republican leadership, to push back on this egregious waste of taxpayer money. With that, I yield back to Representative Lieu.
Thank you. Let me again conclude by thanking Congressman Gallego and Congressman Raskin for highlighting this issue with me today. This really is an issue about the public trust. Taxpayer funds should not be used for luxury private jet travel. It's a very simple issue. Please join us in supporting the Swamp Flyer Act. Please join Congressman Gallego and us in calling for the resignation of Secretary Price. And as Abraham Lincoln said, public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. Help us change public sentiment and help us tell the Trump administration, please stop using taxpayer funds for luxury jets.